Welcome to The Pulse with Lauren Bango, a DLL podcast series. This is your place for tips, trends, and insights into the world of healthcare finance. Now, here's Laura. Welcome to The Pulse
back.
with Lauren Bango,
Today we are discussing
a
the
DLL
life science
podcast
lab
series.
equipment industry.
This is
And
your
we are
place for
joined
tips,
by
trends,
Johnny
and
Finance,
insights into
or
the
John
world of
Plantier,
healthcare
depending
finance.
on how he feels today.
Now, here's
What's going
Laura.
on, everybody? Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming back. Let's start with life sciences is really, really broad. Can we talk a little bit about what's it mean?
You don't want to talk about macroeconomics and rates and anything like that from previous weeks, Lauren? You want to talk about something else?
I am 100% positive that we are going to get into all of that.
That's next week, right? Or 2 weeks?
No, I think we're going to incorporate it into today.
Excellent.
There is no kind of trends in the industry without talking about what the industry's doing and how macroeconomics is affecting it. No?
I agree. You know what? Everywhere you look, macroeconomics affect you, whether you work in life sciences, whether you work in healthcare, whether you work in fast food, doesn't matter. It impacts
Office equipment. I know
Office
that we
equipment.
focus in healthcare, but I think it impacts everything.
Sure does. It sure does.
So I'm going to bring us back to life sciences.
Please do.
All right. So, let's talk a little bit about what that means. What companies would you put into the life science industry?
Yeah, so life sciences, the science of life, it's a very broad term, but roughly encompasses a range of scientific disciplines, whether that's biology, chemistry, biochemistry, genetics, pharmacology, food testing could fall into that category, environmental sciences. It's a very broad term that touches on a bunch of different verticals that I just mentioned there.
That's a space that's been really impactful, especially lately, right? I'm thinking, the pandemic and the vaccines. Am I thinking about that right?
You are. So if you were to put, and I know you love sports terms, it's safe to say that 2021 was the Super Bowl for life sciences when it came to all of those studies, and with the pandemic of studying vaccines, a major influx of cash into the industry that led to a variety of different testing and other initiatives. Federal funding was more available there. There was so much that happened in 2021 that it is clear to say that the pandemic has changed the industry for the better on a go-forward basis.
Okay. And I think you called out some of those changes. Are there any, I think one of the things that we've seen across the board is that supply chain change.
Mhm.
And I know that we've seen that in all types of industries, but this is one that I think impacted life sciences in particular.
You are correct. So there's a term out there that is called decentralizing now, and that's the most common term when it comes to not just currency, decentralizing currency like crypto, but also supply chain. And what that means is a lot of manufacturers are no longer focused on direct single supplier, whether that's raw materials, whether those are computer chips coming from overseas, where they might be. Decentralizing is basically trying to come up with a variety of different suppliers. So should supply chain constraints happen yet again, there's many more avenues that our partners can go to help alleviate some of the pain that came with an issue like the pandemic.
That's got to be super difficult for companies in this space, though, because when I think about the equipment, right, that you use to create some of these things, and I'm focused right now. My brain is focused on the vaccine, for example. So all of the testing equipment and all of that goes into that's pretty specialized. So, finding multiple vendors has to be really difficult.
It is, but it's also good for the economy though, because that spurs activity outside of let's say dedication to these specific suppliers. So gets away from these uh, big word here, monopolistic. Is that even a word? Monopolistic, basically monopoly
I was about to
certain
say,
of certain materials there,
I'll
and
take
spurs.
boardwalk.
Great one. And spurs economic growth outside of those specific suppliers that people are working with. So it's actually a good thing that this occurred.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and another problem I think we were seeing, not only what from the suppliers themselves, but also in terms of getting things, right? So we're in North America, and a lot of things that were coming to a lot of these companies were a lot of the supplies were coming from overseas. And so the actual logistics in getting that over here was part of the problem in that supply chain.
You are correct yet again, Lauren. You've done your research here. So what a
I've done
lot
my
of
homework.
yeah, what a lot of the manufacturers have done to shorten that is say, I'd rather have more inventory here locally than to wait for shipment to occur there. But even that creates a different level of cost too, because you need storage space, warehousing. Some of this equipment that we talk about in life sciences is very sensitive to make sure that everything is up to snuff from a compliance standpoint. But the benefit of that is should there be supply constraints like we just experienced, you no longer have that worry of having shipments overseas and you actually have inventory here in the States. So we see a lot of manufacturers taking that model as well to say, I'd rather pay to have that equipment here in the States um, as opposed to having it come from overseas.
Got it. And so now you have increased costs from storing it over here, I'm assuming, and I think we've seen shipping costs across the board go up. Are we seeing pricing increase?
Yeah, so the life science space was not immune to that, and we saw this across many industries that a lot of our manufacturing partners have now decided to pass those costs on to the end user here. You can finance that cost too, by the way, Lauren. Just throwing that out there. But
Totally can.
the cost has been now passed on where it used to be able to absorb it, but the shipping cost just got so outrageous there for a period of time that it no longer made sense. So what do these manufacturers do? They say, hey, we have to pass this cost over, and so cost eventually hits the end user there.
That makes sense to me. So I'm going to take a step back as you were describing a lot of the space that life sciences encompasses, and maybe I said that poorly, but I heard a lot of those spaces that we think of research and development, where people are going out and they have the idea that's going to solve something that impacts us all, and so they're working on that, and that's a lot of developmental stage companies. Would you agree?
Absolutely. So, what we saw in 2021, right, was a major investment, a lot of venture capitalists wanting to invest their money, and a boon in startup organizations, right, to do a variety of different developmental stage work on things. And those companies are developmental stage, meaning that they're early on in their beginning here. So with the pandemic, you had an influx of cash, a major need in the market, and that created this major boom in startup organizations. Now, startup organizations, they need capital. They need to be able to run
Sure.
some of the tests or panel S's, whatever it is that they're working on. All that falls under that life science space. So to do that, to do their work, they need equipment, and to get equipment, they need capital. So there was a major push now, and leasing is a major way, a major access to capital for these organizations to be able to acquire that equipment.
That makes sense to me. And so and I'm assuming, that you can in fact lease to a development stage company.
That is true. However, there are some structuring requirements that we look for. The more established an organization is, then the more predictable it is from an underwriting standpoint. But if it's in the beginning stages, you obviously don't have that luxury of seeing the performance of the organization, right? So yes, we can do startup organizations. Sometimes the structuring comes in the form of a down payment, a shorter term, but yes, we can absolutely finance to a startup organization.
And I've got to imagine from their standpoint, a down payment is still a heck of a lot better for their cash flow than the full cost of capital.
You got it, right? So your options are either you make a significant capital outlay to acquire that piece of equipment, or you make a small little capital outlay there to be able to spread your payment out over a long period of time there, whatever that term might consist of. So yes, matching your cash flow with the revenue aspect is critical. And even though you are making a down payment with that, it still is a better option than it is of making a significant capital outlay from day one.
I I've got it. And now we're going to tie it all together, and we're going to speak the language that Johnny Finance loves.
Sure.
So, we have an industry that is essential. From food testing to make sure that what we're eating is what we expect, to developmental stage pharmaceuticals and everything in between. And we've talked about why financing's interesting to them. We've talked about what's going on with them, but we haven't talked about those macro trends other than hinting at it at the beginning and how that's impacting them. So I'm going to start us off with saying, I read some articles on kind of Silicon Valley Bank and regional banks, and I know that life sciences was one of those industries that was harder, not hardest, but harder hit by that change. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that we've talked about in our earlier conversations about macro trends, and maybe even give us an update now?
Sure.
Um, and really kind of tie that back to this space.
So if we look at Silicon Valley Bank, for instance, 12% of the bank's 173 billion with a B in deposits came from the life sciences and healthcare sectors.
That's a huge number.
It's massive. Um, so yes, that whole Silicon Valley Bank shook up the industry quite well, and venture capitalists, which is a venture capital is a major form of funding for a lot of these organizations. Uh, they're now becoming more stringent with their money, right? And a part of that has to do with Silicon Valley Bank and the failure that we saw there. Fortunately, the resolution worked out quite well and access to cash there, but the cost of capital has still gone up very high. And when the cost of capital goes up like that, these companies, it becomes more difficult for them to acquire the attractive funding like you would get as you saw in 2021, where the cost of capital is very cheap, right? Then the next part of that goes into the venture capitalist firms themselves are becoming more stringent as to where they want to place their investments. And you saw, I made a joke about the Super Bowl in 2021 from a venture capital perspective. That has now lessened. Now it lessened, but it's still at a level that is comparable to 2020, which is significantly higher than where it was in 2019.
So we're
So
talking field goal versus touchdown.
that's a great. I can't believe you even
Aren't you
knew
so
how to
proud
say
of
that. I'm
me?
so proud of you with that. That is fantastic. Yes, correct. So it's still 4 times higher than what it was in 2019 from an investment standpoint here. So it's still very good. The pandemic changed the industry that for the better, but that Super Bowl period, we're now in that Super Bowl hangover type of trend here.
Ugh, nobody likes a hangover.
No,
All right. So we've got that piece of it. Now talk to me a little bit about, we've been talking about rates too, right? So we've talked in prior episodes, and if you haven't heard them, I suggest you listen in. But we've talked about the impact to rates that some of these regional banks have. We've talked about inflation, what's been happening, and maybe if you wouldn't mind tying that back to kind of how that impacts this particular industry, that would be great.
sure. So rates are still increasing. You still have this Fed meeting coming up in the first week in May. There's an 85% probability as of today that they're going to raise rates by another 25 bips. So, although we thought that we were in the point where we might not see short-term rates rise again. That's not true. We're going to see another 25 bip increase, most likely, assuming we don't have another event between now and then, which, gosh, who only knows at this point. But what that means for us here from a financing perspective, it's possible that rates continue to go up, right? So what we want to do is make sure that for those investors who absolutely need that equipment right now, don't make the significant capital outlay because cash is king. Explore your options when it comes to financing because you don't know what rates are going to be at the end of this year. So this might be your best bet when it comes from a rate environment perspective. And it goes back to that golden rule of making sure that your revenue matches your cash flow from an outlay standpoint. So if you follow those three principles there, now is a great time to finance and explore your options.
And be involved. Talk early and often, if I recall correctly.
Early and often, especially when we get into options, like, is ownership really key here, Lauren? Like, if you think about this space, and many times it could be for short-term use of the equipment, or you're getting a grant to perform some experiments or do some testing. Are you really curious in ownership, or do you just want use of the equipment? So if it's use of the equipment and you want to maximize utilizing the equipment but keeping your costs low, that's where fair market value becomes interesting too for certain customers as well.
That makes sense. And that's obviously something we can explore once we know what people are looking for.
You know what? You got it. We provide solutions to their problems.
What is one piece of advice that you can leave those listening with?
Yeah, it's the concept of spreading the cost of capital over time. For this session, that's what you're focusing on. That significant capital outlay in an already cash-strapped industry with some of that venture capitalist money drying up. It's much better from a business perspective to spread that cost of capital out over time.
Makes complete sense. Thank you very much. If I heard you correctly, I heard we're going to probably need to have you back in the next week or so
I look forward to it.
Follow up on that Fed meeting.
Favorite topic.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time. We will talk soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The Pulse with Lauren Bango, a DLL podcast series. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants. Nothing herein should be construed as legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. Join us again for the next edition of The Pulse. And thanks again for listening.